So one of the most important rules of figuring out how to connect to your supervisor and how to work with your supervisor really is this: work with your supervisor. I mean, it does sound completely stupid and unnecessary to mention this, but so often I do see students who I see at the beginning when they're writing a master thesis, and then I see them again when they're handing it in. And that's such a lost opportunity to just, learn something and also make it easy for yourself to produce a thesis that's really great and that's outstanding. You can think of this a bit like a master and apprentice system. It just works if those two connect. If there's no connection, the learning really is hampered. So this would be my number one advice for you when it comes to working with a supervisor. Just really put in the work, just communicate, just develop a plan together. And this will certainly set you up for success. When you have multiple research questions, please make sure to check whether they're really congruent to each other. So if you have like one main research question and several sub-research questions, the sub-research question really should be part of your overarching research question, right? That's why they're called a sub-research question. Although often I do kind of miss the link between those two. And that said, in the first place, check whether you really want to have multiple research questions. For more qualitative work, I guess that's mostly very acceptable. If it's more quantitative work, really try to see whether it makes sense. Because what you do not want to do is you do not want to dilute your focus. Really, a research question is all about focus. So the moment that the number of research questions really interferes with that, please reconsider. Focus on one research question, or at least focus on a bunch of research questions that really go together. This is not just about semantics, about changing the sentence, etc. This is really about the overarching theme of having a clear goal, a question that you want to find an answer to. So once you have figured out your research question, and when you're more or less certain about the nature, the general approach of your thesis that you take, like in methods part, there are two major things that you need to find an answer to when it comes to, fleshing out the details for your disposition. And that is, whom do you want to study, or whom do you want to ask, and what are you going to ask, or what are you going to observe? Right? These are the two main things for the data collection, and the data really determines what your options are for analysis. So answer those two questions first thing after you have your research question at hand. If you're a bit lost in terms of how to further break down your research question, when you kind of have this hunch, well, maybe it's still a bit too broad, there's one additional element that you can think of, and that's the perspective, right? So what is the general perspective? So that could mean like a theoretical perspective, a disciplinary perspective, something like that. From which angle do you look at the given object? And that could also mean, for instance, that there are multiple perspectives involved. And that's super interesting to think about the implications of that. Say, for example, you want to do some exploratory work and you're maybe thinking about interviews or some other qualitative method. Then the question really of perspective is really important. Do you want to have, just one direction, one perspective, say 10 interviews from the same population? Or is it more a thing that spans over multiple perspectives, maybe disciplinary borders, so you have subgroups, basically subpopulations on which you sample of each of them? Could also mean that you're doing a focus group, for instance, and bring those subgroups together to debate something. So this one tiny element of choosing a perspective is actually super helpful in moving your research question and your research project forward. When it comes to labeling methods, I often see in dispositions some kind of vagueness and some problems with specific terms, especially interviews and case studies. These are like super interchangeably used often, while they really describe something completely different, right? So a case study is usually more like a design, I would say. Usually you have multiple methods within a case study, and interviews, well, could be one of those methods, for instance, that enter your case study. So this is really important to consider, like what exactly are you actually doing? And I really want to urge you to just go above those labels. The labels are nice, they're shortcuts, that's great. But often what you really want to have and what you want to communicate to your potential supervisor is clarity. I know what I'm doing and these are the steps, and I actually don't care how you label them, right? So always be as descriptive as possible when you're trying to envision your methodological groundwork. Especially when you're using multiple or mixed methods in your research design for your thesis, I really urge you to plan those methods on a timeline, right? Which element comes first? which other element maybe requires some input from a preceding element, etc. All of this is super important. And by displaying those items on a timeline, it also gives you some sense in terms of, okay, how much time do you really have to, say, develop a survey or something. You know, there's this inclination to look at thesis writing as one big blob, and it might seem that you have a lot of time looking at that blob. But if you look beneath that, and you really also understand the dependencies between specific elements of your thesis project, then you see that it's actually not that easy and you probably don't have as much time as you think. So you need a thorough planning and you need a clear vision of where potential bottlenecks are. One mistake that I often see in master thesis research questions or titles of master thesis is that they say they focus on some XYZ something topic in a specific industry. And that by itself doesn't need to be problematic. But the moment you put this in your research question, you make a topic out of this, right? It becomes a question, why is this research question interesting for this specific industry? So think of the following. Think of a hypothetical study that does exactly what you want to do, but in a more general field, right? They're not building any subpopulations. They're just about a relationship, for instance, interested in general. Now, what would your study add if that study already exists? Is there some argument that can be made that your specific subject, your specific population that you want to study, right, that specific industry, that this makes a difference? Because the moment you put this in your research question, the moment you have this in your title, this really becomes the question. You need to have an argument why it is in there. That, of course, doesn't mean that you cannot just focus on a specific niche without having it in a research question. Right? You could study something general, but based on the data in a specific context. Yes, this might be a limitation, which you can debate in your limitation section, but at least it will free you from the effort of really making a clear argument up front. Now, I'm not saying that there's any right way to handle this, but just be clear that if it's in the research question, if it's in the title, you really need to argue for it. What I see with master thesis, especially from institutes of applied science, there is a tendency to take some pressing issue, some challenge from practice, and, well, try to write some research about it. And that's all good, but there often is one problem, and it's often a problem of terminology. That is, there are concepts out there in practice that are like, political concepts, they are business terms, business lingo, and these are not necessarily the same terms that are used in research and in science. So if you have one of those topics that are, a bit like trendy maybe in the workplace, say something like Industry 4.0, for instance, or maybe when it comes to the more political agenda, lifelong learning, LLL, right? It's such a nice keyword, but it's usually not the word that is used to describe the very same concepts, the very same phenomena in a research context. So if you have the feeling that you're not really finding literature for your topic, it might not be the issue that there's nothing around, but rather it might be that you're using the wrong words. You need to translate your business lingo, whatever, first into scientific language. And that just means some scoping search in the literature to find out, okay, how do they actually call this, what I'm talking about? One method that is very often used, maybe a bit overused actually, for thesis research is the expert interview. Don't get me wrong, expert interview is really a nice method, it's a solid method, and often required for especially very exploratory research questions. But when you say you're doing an expert interview, please always add at least a couple of sentences more saying, well, who is an expert for this particular research question? Right? Because your whole research design, your whole study hinges on this one definition. Who is actually an expert? One of the most important things to really up your productivity in thesis writing is to have a profound structure on the micro level. You need to know not only what kind of sections exist in a thesis, but on a paragraph level, what will you be writing about? This gives you an immense sense of clarity, and also it gives you a clear, workable plan. Okay, now I have 30 minutes of time. In this 30 minutes, I will write one paragraph, say 400 words, about this topic that I've outlined before. This is like a very specific time, and you will probably make very good use of it. Compare that to a calendar entry that says, to do master thesis. That's nothing. Be specific, and for that, have an outline. When it comes to creating a micro outline, one thing that I sometimes see as a kind of a struggle is the volume, right? So how do you scale like the text of the length of the research paper, which might be just like 6,000 words, including the references, to a master thesis, which might be more like 30,000 words. And one concept that I use here is what I call chunks. So basically, in my writing courses, I structure the whole thesis in about 40 chunks. So those 40 chunks give you the necessary information that really leads you from the start to the end in a logical manner. This is like the bare bones argument that you're making. Now, depending on the length requirement for your thesis, you just adapt the length of each chunk. So what might be like 250 words in a research paper might be 750 words or maybe even more in a master thesis. And that's a very crucial step, because what you usually don't want to do is you don't just want to enter new sections. Oh, I could be writing about the historical development of this concept XYZ. That's really a mistake that I see in many master theses, because yeah, it's kind of a way I need to find some words to write, I need to fill some space, but that often violates the ultimate strategy behind a thesis, and that is you have one research question, and every sentence, every word that you write should at least go in the direction of answering it. So when you're doing quantitative research, you usually break down your research question into multiple relationships or some statements that make sense based on your model. And one problem that I do sometimes see is that when you're developing the hypotheses, you are losing sight of the overall research question. I often say that, the research question is not really that important for quantitative research, because the hypotheses are really that what drives the statistical methods, etc. But also you don't want to lose sight of the research question completely, right? It's still the umbrella under which all your model, all your hypotheses should have a home. So often, for instance, one pattern that I sometimes see, which hardly ever makes sense, if you have like concept 1 relating to concept 2, for instance, and then concept 3 relating to concept 4. That just by looking at the structure of this looks like 2 separate research questions. Don't do that. Say you have a research model and you now want to find some scales for your quantitative research. How do you do that? Well, there are 3 major steps or 3 major strategies that you can apply. The first one would be probably the most direct one, and that is to go and look in scale repositories. There are not that many around, but if you do find it in such a repository, that's usually a quite good thing, because those repositories are usually well maintained and you get heaps of information that will help you to move your study forward. The second, slightly more indirect way is to just have a Google search for it, like on Google Scholar, of course, and that is you look for the main concept that you wish to study and just add scale. Maybe add measurement instrument, measurement, something like that. Often you will find papers that are like scale development or scale validation papers. So if you find any of those keywords in the title, that's already a good sign. So just open that paper and see whether you can find the full text. If you don't find the full text and the full items of the scale, also be free to, just write the corresponding author an email asking for the instrument and also the permission to use it in your thesis. Now, last but not least, the third strategy, it's basically the same as the second, just even more indirect. And that is sometimes you don't find like this one paper that also is like really meant to be a scale development paper. Then just search for any quantitative empirical paper that is using the concept that you want to use as well. And just head over to the method section. See, what do they write? How did they measure it? Sometimes, hopefully not too often, this is really like, self-made and there's no real methodological process behind it. That's not so great. But most of the time, I would expect to find some reference there to a proper paper that develops such a measurement. So then just make some backward tracking in the reference list to that reference, find that paper, and see whether you can get all the items there. One tool that I sometimes use to conceptualize my surveys is what I call capacity planning. And I really advise you as a master thesis student, as a bachelor thesis student, to do the same. So the point is this: you have a quantitative research question, you want to have a survey, and now the question really is, okay, how much can you actually put into this model? You don't have infinite resources on the end of the respondents, so your model cannot be infinitely large, right? Makes a lot of sense. All right, so how do you find out what makes sense? Well, first of all, what's our assumption here? What is the average time that individuals give to you because they're responding to your survey? Well, I would say something between 10 and 15 minutes. That's usually a good choice. Of course, if the contacts are somewhat warmer, if they know you better, then this might be more. But then probably this will also be like a kind of biased sample. So let's calculate with 10, 12 minutes to be on the safe side. Then the question, of course, is if you think of some basic item, like a Likert scale format of 1 to 5 to tick, how long do you need for one item to kind of understand what this is about and make a correct tick? Well, it depends a bit, but my estimation would be that in 10 to 12 minutes, usually will fit in like 80 items. That should be doable. Of course, it depends a bit on the population, right? If they're children, if they're maybe elderly people, then adjust for that, okay? But let's now run with 80. Now, of those 80, you probably have some control variables that you need to have in your model anyway, say 5 to 10 maybe. So that leaves you at, say, 70 items that you have space to fill with your concept. Now, 70 sounds quite a lot at the moment still, but it really depends, because sometimes you might have like very big concepts in there that you want to measure. Maybe it's a big 5 for personality. I had employability for my dissertation. That's like 50 items in one go. That's just one concept, right? And suddenly you're left with a very tight space for probably a lot of models still that needs to be measured. So that's why I really recommend is to go through this capacity planning exercise up front, because if you don't have the space to test your whole model in the survey, you have a problem and you need to adjust your model accordingly.